I'm Michael Quinn Patton, here to spotlight another of our thought leaders' great contributions to evaluation that help give us insights that have built our profession. Today I'm going to feature the insights of Rodney K. Hopson on how and why language matters. Rodney Hopson was president of the American Evaluation Association in 2012 and brought to that position his background in sociolinguistics and educational evaluation. In 2000, he edited a special issue of New Directions for Evaluation on how and why language matters. And in that volume, he set out to illuminate how language shapes meanings of the social policies and programs we evaluate. He wrote, "Distinguishing language of and in evaluation is a prerequisite for understanding why and how language matters in evaluation. Language of evaluation refers to the terms, concepts, and associated meanings that help set the frame for evaluation. In simple terms, it is most often characterized as the language used by evaluators, researchers, and policymakers. Generally technical, it separates the evaluation community from other disciplines and profession-oriented communities, allowing us to speak to ourselves intellectually and conceptually. Language in evaluation refers to the language in which evaluation questions, data, and results are cast. Therefore, it refers to the ideas and values that become privileged in discourse about the social policy or program being evaluated. For example, evaluating a welfare reform initiative by assessing how many people get off welfare is substantively and politically different from evaluating the same initiative by assessing the nature and scope of, quote, meaningful work opportunities, close quote, as identified by former welfare recipients. Attention to language in evaluation points to the importance of stakeholder inclusion in evaluation, of listening to the language of especially diverse program beneficiaries, and to the concepts, experiences, and value stances this language captures. Rodney, in a 2012 New Directions volume, Rodney wrote about decolonizing evaluation. He said, quote, "At a recent AEA presentation at the 2012 conference, a good friend and mentor chided me for advancing notions of decolonizing evaluation. He admonished my use of those concepts and thought that funders and clients would be off-put by the word, quote, decolonizing, period, close quote." Rodney continued, quote, "It only occurred to me after he sat down next to me that he was issuing me a challenge to clarify how and why evaluation should serve in liberating and decolonizing ways. Quote, surely he could not be telling me not to use the terms, but to make clear why these liberating and decolonizing notions in the field would serve groups often marginalized and underrepresented, close quote. So Rodney suggested evaluation has a role, an important role to play in extricating and illuminating power differentials, fairness, and justice. Evaluators have a responsibility to be attentive to language and meanings, to clarify our terms, to think about their political context, derivation, and meaning, and how they are heard by the people we work with, and to be sensitive to the language that's meaningful to them. When I was doing the Blue Marble evaluation book, there was a chapter devoted initially to what we were going to call global competence, to parallel the cultural competence statement adopted by the American Evaluation Association. But since the adoption of that statement, some of those involved, including Rodney, had begun to think about the heritage of the word competence, the way in which that word had traditionally been used in colonial and in oppressive settings in the United States to limit participation, you had to be competent to vote as an African American in the South and therefore pass a voting or literacy test. Competence was used in colonial countries to limit who could serve, to impose the criteria of the colonial power on indigenous and local people. Competence, at the same time, is a relatively low level. We don't want doctors who are just competent. We want doctors who are excellent. We don't just need competent evaluators. We need excellent evaluators. So after some dialogue, we abandoned the term global competence for world savvy, to be more than just competent, but to be savvy about what's going on. Having borrowed that term from a program here in Minnesota that is aimed at helping high school students become more world savvy. The language around the climate situation. For a while we talked about global warming. Others have suggested we ought to talk about global heating or the climate emergency. But we most often simply talk about climate change. How we term things, how we characterize things makes a difference. The murder of George Floyd and the subsequent quote-unquote demonstrations are very different than simply describing the death of George Floyd or talking about demonstrations instead of a global social justice uprising. And so our language matters. As Rodney said in that 2014 New Directions article, evaluators make choices about the type of values and interests they promote. Evaluation as liberating and decolonizing challenges existing social orders and situations that reinforce have-nots, those marginalized and oppressed, by bringing to surface inequitable issues that exist in the system. Euphemisms Society each year chooses a euphemistic word of the year. And that word in 2022 was unalive, a term that has become used, especially in some social media, as a euphemism for dying, certainly, for someone who has died, but especially with reference to suicide. And so, as we deal with that language in issues of importance in society, it's part of our responsibility to, as evaluators, to deal with clarity of language and to think about our own susceptibility to euphemisms. Euphemisms that I've tracked over the years include the word pavement deficiencies for potholes, enhanced interrogation techniques for torture, negative growth described by companies that have lost money, revenue enhancements used to describe taxes, and incomplete success, one of my favorites, what President Carter called the completely failed attempt to rescue hostages from Iran, where the helicopters crashed and some of the rescuers were killed and no hostages were rescued. In his press announcement, he said that initiative had been, quote, an incomplete success. But my favorite is how the 1983 U.S. invasion of Grenada was described by President Ronald Reagan. In announcing that invasion, it was called, quote, a pre-dawn vertical insertion. Good many of you have experience with that phenomenon, and I was working in the Caribbean at that time, and that's pretty much how people saw the experience of the U.S. invasion of Grenada, a pre-dawn vertical insertion. And so we have to turn to evaluation language and think about how that connotes things. Targeting respondents, experimental mortality, referring to the loss of respondents from pre-test to post-test, needs assessment, as opposed to looking at also the strengths of people. Statistical significance, which the American Statistical Association has now banned because of the meaninglessness of the term. What comes to mind for you as evaluation language that may be problematic, misunderstood, out of date, time to abandon? Consider the effects of how we ask simple things like background categories. To ask the question, what is your race, carries the message that race exists. But if we ask, in what racial category does society place you, that carries the message that race is a social construction in which society places people in these socially constructed categories. And so, how and why language matters in evaluation is an ongoing issue. And Rodney Hopson brought that to our attention and continues to. As he said, evaluators make choices about the type of values and interests they promote. Evaluation as liberating and decolonizing challenges existing orders and situations that reinforce have-nots, those marginalized and oppressed, by bringing to surface inequitable issues that exist in the system. In your ongoing work, whether you're an evaluator, whatever work you're involved in, language matters, communication matters. Think about where our words come from, what our phrases connote, and how that affects how we engage with each other.